Subscribe to Boring Science for sleep for new videos every day. Now, let us begin. The substance known as paper, which is encountered in nearly every aspect of modern daily existence, is a material that has been produced by human civilizations for a remarkably extended period of time. And the history of its development is one that stretches back over 2 millennia, involving a slow and gradual progression of techniques that were refined, adapted, and transmitted across vast geographical distances over the course of many centuries. It is generally acknowledged by historians of technology that the invention of paper, in a form that would be recognizable to contemporary observers, is attributed to a Chinese court official named Cailun, who is recorded as having presented his method of papermaking to the emperor He of the Eastern Han Dynasty in the year 105 AD, a date that has been referenced in countless scholarly works and is considered one of the more significant milestones in the long chronicle of human material culture. However, it must be noted, and this is a point that is frequently emphasized by archaeologists and historians who specialize in the study of ancient Chinese technologies, that the attribution of the invention of paper solely to Cailun is something of an oversimplification, because archaeological evidence has demonstrated that paper-like materials were being produced in China at dates considerably earlier than 105 AD. Fragments of what appear to be primitive paper have been discovered at various archaeological sites in China, with some of the oldest known specimens dating to approximately the 2nd century BC, which is to say, roughly 200 years before Cailun is recorded as having presented his innovation to the imperial court. These early fragments, which were recovered from tombs and other archaeological contexts, were produced from materials such as hemp fibers and were considerably rougher and less uniform than the paper that Cailun is credited with developing. But they are nonetheless recognized as being forms of paper in the technical sense of the term, which is to say, they consist of matted plant fibers that have been formed into thin sheets through a process involving the suspension of fibers in water and their subsequent deposition onto a flat surface. What Cailun appears to have contributed, according to the historical record preserved in texts such as the Book of Later Han, was a systematic refinement and standardization of the papermaking process, which involved the use of a wider range of raw materials, including tree bark, hemp, old rags, and fishing nets, and which resulted in a product that was of notably higher quality and greater consistency than the paper-like materials that had been produced before his time. The significance of this achievement should not be understated, as it was the development of a reliable and repeatable method for producing paper of consistent quality that enabled the material to become widely adopted throughout Chinese society for purposes including writing, wrapping, and various other applications that had previously relied on more expensive or less convenient materials, such as silk or bamboo strips. For several centuries following the innovations attributed to Cailun, the knowledge of how to produce paper remained largely confined to China, where the technology continued to be refined and where paper came to be used for an ever-expanding range of purposes, including the production of books, the creation of paper money, and even the manufacture of items such as paper clothing and paper armor, which, while perhaps not as durable as their fabric or metal equivalents, were notable for their lightness and low cost. The techniques of Chinese papermaking were closely guarded, and it was not until the 8th century AD that the knowledge began to spread beyond the borders of China, an event that is traditionally associated with the Battle of Talas in 751 AD, a military engagement between the forces of the Tang dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate that took place in what is now modern-day Kazakhstan. According to historical accounts, which are admittedly somewhat fragmentary and subject to varying interpretations, Chinese papermakers were among the prisoners captured by the Abbasid forces at the Battle of Talas, and these captive artisans were subsequently compelled to share their knowledge of papermaking with their captors, thereby introducing the technology to the Islamic world. Whether or not this specific narrative is entirely accurate in all its details, it is well established that papermaking did indeed spread to the Islamic world during this general period, and that by the late 8th century, paper mills were operating in cities such as Samarkand, which became an important center for paper production and from which the technology subsequently spread to other parts of the Islamic world, including Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. The paper produced in the Islamic world was initially made using techniques that were closely derived from Chinese methods, but over time, Islamic papermakers developed their own innovations and adaptations, including the use of different raw materials and the introduction of improvements to the manufacturing process that resulted in paper with different characteristics and qualities. One notable development was the widespread use of linen and cotton fibers as raw materials for papermaking, which were more readily available in the Middle East and North Africa than the mulberry bark and other plant fibers that had been commonly used in China. The paper produced from these fibers had a somewhat different texture and appearance than Chinese paper, but it was well suited to the needs of Islamic scribes and scholars, who used it extensively for the production of manuscripts, administrative documents, and other written materials. From the Islamic world, the knowledge of papermaking gradually made its way to Europe, a process that occurred over the course of several centuries and that followed the general patterns of cultural and technological exchange between the Islamic and Christian civilizations of the medieval Mediterranean. The first paper mill in Europe is generally considered to have been established in the town of Zataiva, in what is now the Valencia region of Spain, at some point in the 11th or early 12th century. A location that reflects the close proximity of the Iberian Peninsula to the Islamic world and the extensive cultural interactions that took place between Muslim and Christian communities in medieval Spain. From Spain, papermaking spread to other parts of Europe, with Italy becoming a particularly important center for the production of paper during the 13th century. The Italian town of Fabriano, located in the Marche region of central Italy, became especially renowned for its paper production and is credited with introducing several significant innovations to the European papermaking tradition. Among the contributions attributed to the papermakers of Fabriano, who were active from approximately the mid-13th century onward, are the introduction of watermarks as a means of identifying the origin and quality of paper. The use of animal-derived gelatin sizing as a surface treatment to improve the writing properties of paper, and the adoption of the stamping mill, which employed water-powered hammers to beat the raw fibers into a pulp that was more suitable for forming into sheets of paper than the fibers that had been processed using earlier, less efficient methods. These innovations, which were gradually adopted by papermakers throughout Europe over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries, significantly improved the quality and consistency of European paper and contributed to the establishment of a thriving paper industry that would play an essential role in supporting the intellectual and cultural developments of the Renaissance and the subsequent invention of movable type printing by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century. The basic process of making paper by hand, as it was practiced for centuries before the development of mechanized papermaking in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, involved a series of steps that, while varying somewhat in their specific details from one region or time period to another, followed a general pattern that can be described in reasonably straightforward terms. The process began with the preparation of the raw material, which, in European papermaking from the medieval period onward, typically consisted of cotton or linen rags that had been collected and sorted according to their quality and condition. These rags were first cut into small pieces and then subjected to a process of retting or controlled decomposition, in which they were soaked in water for an extended period, often several weeks, to soften the fibers and begin the process of breaking down the non-fibrous components of the material. Following the retting process, the softened rags were transferred to a stamping mill, where they were beaten by heavy wooden or iron hammers that were powered by a water wheel or similar mechanism. The purpose of this beating or pulping was to separate the individual fibers of the raw material from one another, and to reduce them to a state in which they could be evenly dispersed in water to form a slurry, or suspension, of fibers known as pulp or stuff. The duration and intensity of the beating process had a significant effect on the quality of the finished paper, with longer and more thorough beating generally producing a smoother and more uniform product, while less thorough beating resulted in paper with a coarser texture and less even surface. The beating process typically required several hours to complete and was one of the most labor-intensive and time-consuming aspects of traditional hand papermaking. Once the raw material had been reduced to a suitable pulp, the actual process of forming sheets of paper could begin. This was accomplished using a device known as a mold, which consisted of a wooden frame across which was stretched a screen made of closely spaced parallel wires, held in place by perpendicular support wires known as chain lines. The mold was accompanied by a removable wooden frame called a decal, which fitted over the top of the mold and served to contain the pulp on the surface of the screen and to define the edges of the sheet being formed. The vatman, as the worker who formed the sheets was traditionally known, would dip the mold and decal together into a vat containing the diluted pulp, lift them out, and then shake the mold gently from side to side and front to back to encourage the fibers to mat together evenly and to allow the excess water to drain through the screen. The skill of the vatman was of considerable importance in determining the quality and uniformity of the finished sheets, as the evenness with which the pulp was distributed across the surface of the mold, the speed with which the mold was lifted from the vat, and the manner in which it was shaken to promote drainage and fiber bonding all had significant effects on the thickness, uniformity, and overall quality of the resulting paper. A skilled vatman could produce several hundred sheets of paper in a working day, although the exact number varied depending on the size of the sheets being made, the nature of the pulp being used, and various other factors. After the sheet had been formed on the mold and sufficient water had drained away to allow the sheet to hold together, the decal was removed, and the sheet was transferred from the mold to a piece of damp felt in a process known as couching, a term derived from the French word coucher, meaning to lay down. The coucher, as the worker performing this operation was known, would invert the mold onto the felt and press gently to release the newly formed sheet from the screen. This process required considerable skill and care, as the wet sheet was extremely fragile and could easily be torn or distorted if handled improperly. The couched sheets were stacked in alternating layers with pieces of felt, forming a pile known as a post, which typically contained between 100 and 200 sheets of paper separated by an equal number of felts. Once a sufficient number of sheets had been formed and couched, the post was subjected to pressing in a heavy wooden or iron screw press, which served to squeeze out a large proportion of the water remaining in the sheets and to compact the fibers, thereby increasing the density and strength of the paper. The pressing operation typically involved several stages, with the pressure being gradually increased to avoid damaging the still fragile sheets. After pressing, the individual sheets were carefully separated from the felts, a process known as parting, and were then hung up to dry, either on ropes stretched across a drying loft or on specially designed wooden frames. The drying process could take several days, depending on the prevailing temperature and humidity conditions, and the manner in which the sheets were dried had a significant effect on the properties of the finished paper. Sheets that were dried too quickly tended to become cockled, or wavy, while sheets that were dried too slowly were at risk of developing mold or other forms of biological deterioration. Once the sheets had been thoroughly dried, they were typically subjected to a sizing treatment, which involved dipping them in a solution of animal gelatin or, in later periods, a starch-based preparation, in order to reduce the absorbency of the paper and improve its suitability for writing with ink. The sized sheets were then dried again and smoothed by pressing or rubbing to produce the finished product. It is at this point that one might consider the fundamental nature of the material from which most paper has been made since the mid-19th century, which is to say, wood, and more specifically, the cellulosic fibers that are obtained from wood through various chemical and mechanical processes that will be described in greater detail in subsequent portions of this narrative. Wood is a complex biological material that is composed of several distinct chemical components, the relative proportions of which vary depending on the species of tree, the part of the tree from which the wood is obtained, and various other factors, but which can be described in general terms as consisting primarily of three major classes of compounds: cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. Cellulose, which is the component of wood that is of primary interest in the context of papermaking, is a polysaccharide, which is to say, a polymer composed of many units of the simple sugar glucose linked together in long, straight chains by what are known as beta-1,4 glycosidic bonds. The cellulose content of wood typically ranges from approximately 40 to 50% of the total dry weight of the material, depending on the species. Each cellulose molecule consists of several hundred to several thousand glucose units arranged in a linear chain, and these chains have a strong tendency to align themselves parallel to one another and to form hydrogen bonds with neighboring chains, creating structures known as microfibrils, which are bundles of cellulose chains that are partially crystalline in nature and which possess considerable tensile strength. It is this tendency of cellulose molecules to form strong intermolecular bonds with one another that is fundamental to the papermaking process, as it is the formation of hydrogen bonds between cellulose fibers during the drying of a sheet of paper that gives the finished product its strength and coherence. Hemicellulose, which constitutes approximately 20 to 30% of the dry weight of wood, is a term that encompasses a group of polysaccharides that are chemically distinct from cellulose and that differ from cellulose in several important respects. Unlike cellulose, which is composed exclusively of glucose units arranged in a linear chain, hemicelluloses are composed of a variety of different sugar units, including xylose, mannose, galactose, and arabinose, and their molecular chains are typically shorter and more branched than those of cellulose. Hemicelluloses serve as a matrix material in the cell walls of wood, filling the spaces between the cellulose microfibrils and contributing to the overall structural integrity of the wood. In the context of papermaking, the presence of hemicellulose in pulp fibers is generally considered to be beneficial to a certain extent, as hemicelluloses can promote the formation of bonds between fibers during the papermaking process. But excessive amounts of hemicellulose can also have negative effects on certain properties of the finished paper. Lignin, the third major component of wood, constitutes approximately 20 to 30% of the dry weight of the material and is a complex, three-dimensional polymer composed of phenylpropane units, linked together in a highly irregular and variable manner. Lignin serves as a binding agent in wood, cementing the cellulose fibers together and providing rigidity and resistance to compression. In the context of papermaking, lignin is generally considered to be an undesirable component, as its presence in paper causes the paper to yellow and become brittle over time when exposed to light and air, a phenomenon that is familiar to anyone who has observed the deterioration of old newspapers or other paper products made from pulp that contains a high proportion of lignin. For this reason, A major objective of many pulping processes is the removal of as much lignin as possible from the wood fibers while retaining as much of the cellulose and useful hemicellulose as possible, a task that, as will be discussed in due course, requires the application of considerable chemical and mechanical energy, and that involves a number of complex and carefully controlled industrial processes. The minor components of wood, which together typically account for less than 10% of the dry weight of the material, include a variety of substances such as extractives, which are organic compounds that can be removed from wood by solvents, and which include resins, fatty acids, terpenes, and various phenolic compounds, as well as inorganic mineral compounds, collectively referred to as ash, which are present in small quantities in the cell walls and lumens of wood cells. These minor components, while constituting only a small fraction of the total mass of wood, can have significant effects on the paper-making process and on the properties of the finished paper. And their removal or management is an important consideration in the design and operation of pulping and paper-making systems. It is worth noting that the structure of wood at the cellular level is itself a matter of considerable complexity, and that an understanding of this structure is helpful, if not strictly necessary, for appreciating the challenges involved in the conversion of wood into paper pulp. Wood is composed of cells, the vast majority of which are elongated and tubular in shape, and which are referred to as fibers in the case of hardwood species, where they are technically known as libriform fibers, and as tracheids in the case of softwood species. In softwoods, which include species such as spruce, pine, and fir, the tracheids are typically 2 to 5 millimeters in length and 20 to 40 micrometers in diameter, and they constitute approximately 90 to 95% of the total volume of the wood. In hardwoods, which include species such as birch, eucalyptus, and aspen, the fibers are generally shorter, typically 0.7 to 1.5 millimeters in length and 10 to 25 micrometers in diameter, and they constitute a smaller proportion of the total wood volume, typically 40 to 70%, with the remainder being made up of vessel elements, which are large diameter cells that serve as conduits for the transport of water in the living tree, and ray cells, which are oriented radially and serve as storage and transport pathways. The cell walls of wood fibers and tracheids are themselves composed of multiple layers, each of which has a distinct composition and structure. The outermost layer, known as the middle lamella, is a thin layer that is rich in lignin and that serves as the adhesive that bonds adjacent cells together. Inside the middle lamella is the primary wall, which is a thin layer of cellulose microfibrils arranged in a random, net-like pattern, and inside the primary wall is the secondary wall, which is the thickest and most important layer from the perspective of paper making, and which is itself divided into 3 sublayers, designated S1, S2, and S3. The S2 layer, which is the thickest of the 3 secondary wall sublayers, typically accounting for 70 to 80% of the total wall thickness, is composed of cellulose microfibrils arranged in a helical pattern at an angle of approximately 10 to 30 degrees to the long axis of the cell. And it is this layer that contributes most significantly to the mechanical properties of both the individual fiber and the paper made from it. The microfibril angle of the S2 layer, which varies depending on the species and the position of the cell within the tree, has a significant influence on the flexibility and conformability of the fiber during papermaking, with lower microfibril angles generally producing stiffer, stronger fibers and higher angles producing more flexible fibers. The distinction between softwood and hardwood fibers is of considerable practical importance in the paper industry, as the two types of fiber have different properties that make them suitable for different applications and that influence the way in which they must be processed. Softwood fibers, with their greater length, are generally preferred for applications where strength is of primary importance, as longer fibers form a more highly interconnected network in the paper sheet and produce paper with higher tensile, tear, and burst strength. Hardwood fibers, with their shorter length and smaller diameter, tend to produce paper with a smoother surface, better formation, and higher opacity, making them preferred for printing and writing papers where surface quality and optical properties are important. In practice, many paper grades are produced using a blend of softwood and hardwood fibers, with the proportions of each being adjusted to achieve the desired balance of strength, surface quality, and other properties. The transition from the use of cotton and linen rags to wood as the primary raw material for papermaking occurred during the first half of the 19th century and was driven by a combination of factors, including the rapidly increasing demand for paper that accompanied the growth of literacy, the expansion of printing and publishing, and the development of mass circulation newspapers, all of which placed enormous strain on the existing supply of rags and led to periodic shortages and corresponding increases in the price of this traditional raw material. The search for alternative fiber sources led a number of inventors and researchers to experiment with wood as a potential raw material for papermaking, and by the 1840s and 1850s, practical methods for producing paper pulp from wood had been developed, marking the beginning of a new era in the history of papermaking that would become the dominant raw material for paper production worldwide, a position that it continues to occupy to the present day. The shift to wood-based papermaking was facilitated by the development of two fundamentally different approaches to the problem of converting wood into a form suitable for paper production, namely mechanical pulping and chemical pulping, each of which has its own advantages and disadvantages, and each of which produces pulp with distinctly different properties. These two approaches, and the various specific processes that fall within each category, will be the subject of detailed examination in the portions of this narrative that follow. But it may be noted here that the essential difference between them lies in the extent to which they rely on mechanical force versus chemical reagents to separate the fibers of the wood and to remove or modify the non-cellulosic components, particularly lignin, that bind the fibers together in the intact wood. The world of paper production is one that is characterized by an extraordinary degree of technical complexity and by a level of precision in process control that might surprise those who think of paper as a simple and unremarkable material. The modern paper industry operates on a vast scale, producing hundreds of millions of metric tons of paper and paperboard products annually. And the processes involved in this production are the result of centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience, refined and optimized through the application of modern science and engineering. It is this story of technological development, from the ancient Chinese techniques of beating hemp fibers and forming sheets on bamboo molds to the massive, computer-controlled paper machines of the 21st century, that constitutes the subject matter of this extended narrative, which will proceed at a measured and unhurried pace through the various aspects of paper-making science and technology, examining each topic in what is hoped to be a sufficient, if perhaps occasionally excessive, degree of detail. The conversion of wood into pulp suitable for the manufacture of paper is accomplished through a range of industrial processes that can be broadly categorized into two principal types, namely mechanical pulping and chemical pulping. And it is the detailed examination of these processes, together with the various intermediate and hybrid methods that combine elements of both approaches, that constitutes the subject matter of this portion of the narrative. The distinction between mechanical and chemical pulping is, at its most fundamental level, a distinction between processes that rely primarily on physical force to separate the fibers of the wood from one another and processes that rely primarily on chemical reagents to dissolve the lignin and other non-cellulosic components that bind the fibers together in the intact wood, thereby releasing the fibers in a relatively undamaged state. Mechanical pulping, which was the first method developed for producing paper pulp from wood on an industrial scale, involves the application of mechanical energy to wood in order to grind, shred, or otherwise physically separate the individual fibers from one another. The earliest form of mechanical pulping, known as stone groundwood pulping, was developed in the 1840s by Friedrich Gottlob Keller, a German weaver and inventor who conceived the idea of pressing logs against a rotating grindstone in the presence of water in order to produce a fibrous material that could be used for papermaking. Keller's invention was subsequently refined and commercialized by Heinrich Volter, and by the 1860s, stone groundwood pulping had become an established industrial process that was being practiced in a number of countries. In the stone groundwood process, which continues to be used in modified form to the present day, short logs, typically measuring between 1 and 2 meters in length and known as bolts, are pressed against the surface of a large, rotating grindstone, which is usually made of natural sandstone or, in more modern installations, of a synthetic abrasive material such as silicon carbide or aluminum oxide embedded in a ceramic or polymer matrix. The grindstone, which may have a diameter of approximately 1.2 to 1.8 meters, and which rotates at a speed of approximately 200 to 300 revolutions per minute, abrades the surface of the wood, separating the fibers from one another and producing a slurry of pulp and water that is collected in a pit beneath the grindstone and subsequently processed further. Water is continuously applied to the grinding zone during the process, serving both to cool the grindstone and the wood and to carry the separated fibers away from the grinding zone. The quality of the pulp produced by the stone groundwood process is influenced by a number of factors, including the species of wood being ground, the condition and sharpness of the grindstone surface, the pressure with which the wood is applied to the stone, the speed of rotation of the stone, the temperature of the grinding zone, and the rate at which water is applied. Stone groundwood pulp typically has a yield of approximately 93 to 98%, which is to say that between 93 and 98% of the original wood substance is retained in the pulp, with only a small proportion being lost as dissolved organic matter in the process water. This high yield is one of the principal advantages of mechanical pulping, as it means that a given quantity of wood produces a significantly larger quantity of pulp than is the case with chemical pulping processes, which typically have yields in the range of 40 to 55%. However, the high yield of mechanical pulping comes at a cost in terms of pulp quality, because the mechanical separation of fibers does not remove the lignin from the wood, and the resulting pulp therefore contains essentially all of the lignin that was present in the original wood. As was noted earlier, the presence of lignin in paper causes it to yellow and become brittle over time, and for this reason, papers made from mechanical pulp, such as newsprint, are generally considered to be of lower quality and shorter longevity than papers made from chemical pulp, from which most of the lignin has been removed. Additionally, the mechanical forces applied during the grinding process cause significant damage to the fibers, shortening them and reducing their strength, which means that papers made from stone groundwood pulp tend to have lower strength properties than papers made from chemical pulp or from mechanical pulps produced by less aggressive methods. The specific energy consumption of the stone groundwood process, which is the amount of electrical energy required to produce a given quantity of pulp, is typically in the range of 1,200 to 2,000 kilowatt-hours per metric ton of pulp, depending on the wood species, the desired pulp properties, and the efficiency of the grinding equipment. This energy consumption, while substantial, is somewhat lower than that of some other mechanical pulping processes, and the relatively low capital and operating costs of stone groundwood mills have ensured that the process continues to be used for the production of pulps intended for applications such as newsprint and other printing papers where brightness, stability, and long-term durability are not of primary concern. A significant advance in mechanical pulping technology occurred with the development of thermomechanical pulping, commonly abbreviated as TMP, which was introduced commercially in the early 1970s and which has since become the most widely used form of mechanical pulping for the production of printing and writing papers. In the TMP process, wood chips, rather than logs, are used as the raw material, and the separation of fibers is accomplished using disc refiners rather than grindstones. A disc refiner consists of two circular plates, each fitted with a pattern of raised bars and grooves on their facing surfaces, with one plate rotating and the other stationary, or in some configurations, both plates rotating in opposite directions. The wood chips are fed into the center of the refiner and are forced outward between the plates by centrifugal force, being progressively broken down into individual fibers and fiber bundles as they pass through the narrowing gap between the plates. The critical distinguishing feature of the TMP process, as its name suggests, is the application of thermal pretreatment to the wood chips prior to refining. In a typical TMP installation, the wood chips are first steamed in a pressurized vessel known as a preheater or digester at temperatures in the range of 110 to 140 degrees Celsius and pressures of approximately 100 to 500 kilopascals above atmospheric pressure for a period of typically 2 to 5 minutes. This steaming treatment softens the lignin in the wood, which undergoes a glass transition at temperatures above approximately 130 to 140 degrees Celsius and becomes more pliable and deformable, which in turn facilitates the separation of fibers during the subsequent refining stage and results in less fiber damage than would occur if the chips were refined without pretreatment. The refining itself is typically carried out in 2 stages, with the first stage, known as primary refining, being performed under pressurized conditions at elevated temperature, and the second stage, known as secondary refining, being performed at atmospheric pressure to further develop the fiber properties and achieve the desired freeness, which is a measure of the drainage rate of the pulp and is an important indicator of its suitability for papermaking. The yield of the TMP process is typically in the range of 90 to 95%, which is slightly lower than that of stone groundwood pulping due to the greater dissolution of wood components that occurs during the steaming pretreatment and the more intensive refining. However, the pulp produced by the TMP process is generally of significantly higher quality than stone groundwood pulp, with longer fibers, greater strength, and better optical properties, which make it suitable for a wider range of paper grades. The specific energy consumption of TMP is typically in the range of 1,800 to 3,000 kilowatt-hours per metric ton of pulp, which is somewhat higher than that of stone groundwood pulping. But the improved pulp quality is generally considered to justify the additional energy expenditure. A further development in mechanical pulping is the chemothermomechanical pulping process, commonly abbreviated as CTMP, which represents a hybrid approach that combines elements of both mechanical and chemical pulping. In the CTMP process, wood chips are subjected to a mild chemical pretreatment, typically involving the application of sodium sulfite or sodium hydroxide at concentrations of approximately 2 to 5% by weight based on the dry weight of the wood, at temperatures in the range of 120 to 170 degrees Celsius, prior to refining. The purpose of this chemical pretreatment is to partially sulfonate and dissolve the lignin in the wood, which further facilitates fiber separation during refining and produces a pulp with improved brightness, strength, and cleanliness compared to TMP. The yield of CTMP is typically in the range of 85 to 92%, reflecting the greater removal of lignin and other wood components that results from the chemical pretreatment. The specific energy consumption of CTMP is typically in the range of 1,500 to 2,500 kilowatt-hours per metric ton, which is somewhat lower than that of TMP due to the chemical softening of the wood prior to refining, which reduces the mechanical energy required to separate the fibers. Chemical pulping, as distinct from the mechanical and chemimechanical processes described above, involves the use of chemical reagents to dissolve the lignin and other non-cellulosic components of the wood, thereby releasing the cellulose fibers in a relatively intact state. The two principal chemical pulping processes in use today are the Kraft process and the sulfite process, of which the Kraft process is by far the more widely used, accounting for approximately 80% of all chemical pulp produced worldwide. The Kraft process, which derives its name from the German and Swedish word for strength, was invented by Carl F. Dahl in 1879 and first implemented on a commercial scale in Sweden in 1890. The process involves the cooking of wood chips in an aqueous solution of sodium hydroxide and sodium sulfide, known as white liquor, at elevated temperature and pressure in a large vessel known as a digester. The sodium hydroxide and sodium sulfide in the white liquor act as the primary reagents for the dissolution of lignin, with the sodium hydroxide attacking and cleaving the various ether and carbon-carbon bonds that link the phenylpropane units of the lignin polymer, while the sodium sulfide enhances the selectivity and speed of the delignification reactions by providing hydrosulfide and sulfide ions that participate in nucleophilic reactions with the lignin. The cooking conditions in the Kraft process typically involve temperatures in the range of 155 to 175 degrees Celsius, with a temperature of approximately 170 degrees Celsius being the most commonly used value for the cooking of softwood species. The cooking time, which is the period during which the chips are maintained at the maximum cooking temperature, is typically in the range of 2 to 4 hours, depending on the wood species, the desired degree of delignification, and other process variables. The ratio of liquid to wood in the digester, known as the liquor-to-wood ratio, is typically in the range of 3 to 1 to 5 to 1 by volume, and the concentration of active chemicals in the cooking liquor, expressed as active alkali on a sodium oxide basis, is typically in the range of 15 to 25% by weight based on the dry weight of the wood. During the cooking process, the lignin in the wood is progressively dissolved and degraded by the action of the cooking chemicals, while the cellulose and hemicellulose fibers are largely preserved. Although some degradation and dissolution of these components also occurs, particularly of the hemicelluloses, which are more susceptible to alkaline degradation than cellulose. The degree of delignification achieved during cooking is commonly expressed using a parameter known as the kappa number, which is a measure of the residual lignin content of the pulp and which is determined by the amount of potassium permanganate consumed by a standard mass of pulp under specified conditions. A typical target kappa number for fully bleachable softwood kraft pulp is in the range of 25 to 35, while for hardwood kraft pulp, the target is typically somewhat lower, in the range of 15 to 22. reflecting the different composition and structure of hardwood and softwood lignins. The yield of the craft process is typically in the range of 40 to 55%, which is significantly lower than the yield of mechanical pulping processes, reflecting the extensive dissolution of lignin and other wood components that occurs during cooking. Of the approximately 45 to 60% of the original wood substance that is dissolved during craft cooking, the majority is lignin, but significant quantities of hemicelluloses and small amounts of cellulose are also lost. The dissolved organic material, together with the spent cooking chemicals, forms a dark-colored solution known as black liquor, which is separated from the pulp after cooking and processed in the chemical recovery system. A critically important component of the craft process that enables the regeneration of the cooking chemicals and the recovery of energy from the dissolved organic matter. The sulfite process, which was the dominant chemical pulping method from the time of its commercial introduction in the 1870s until it was overtaken by the craft process in the mid-20th century, involves the cooking of wood chips in an aqueous solution of sulfurous acid and a bisulfite salt, the cation of which may be calcium, magnesium, sodium, or ammonium. At temperatures that vary depending on the specific variant of the process being used, but which are typically in the range of 130 to 170 degrees Celsius. The sulfite process produces a pulp that is generally lighter in color than craft pulp and that is easier to bleach, but it has several disadvantages compared to the craft process, including its inability to process resinous wood species such as pine, its lower pulp strength, and its less efficient chemical recovery system. Following the pulping stage, whether mechanical or chemical, the resulting pulp typically undergoes a series of processing steps designed to remove impurities, adjust the properties of the pulp, and prepare it for use in the paper-making process. Among the most important of these steps are washing, screening, and, in the case of pulps intended for the production of white papers, bleaching. Pulp washing is the process of removing the dissolved organic and inorganic substances from the pulp after cooking or refining. In chemical pulping, effective washing is essential both for the recovery of cooking chemicals and for the removal of residual lignin and other substances that would otherwise interfere with subsequent bleaching and paper-making operations. The washing of chemical pulp is typically accomplished using a series of countercurrent washing stages, in which the pulp is successively diluted with progressively cleaner water and then thickened by filtration or pressing, with the filtrate from each stage being used as the dilution water for the preceding stage. The most common types of washing equipment used in modern pulp mills include rotary vacuum washers, which consist of large cylindrical drums covered with a permeable screen onto which the pulp is deposited and through which the wash water is drawn by vacuum, and various types of displacement washers and press washers, which achieve washing by displacing the liquor in the pulp mat with clean water or by mechanically pressing the liquor from the pulp. Screening is the process of removing oversized particles, such as uncooked wood chips, fiber bundles known as shives, and other contaminants from the pulp. Modern pulp screening systems typically employ pressure screens, which consist of cylindrical housings containing a perforated screen plate or slotted screen basket through which the acceptable pulp fibers pass, while oversized material is rejected. The rejected material, known as rejects, may be further processed to recover usable fiber or may be removed from the system as waste. Bleaching is the process of increasing the brightness and whiteness of pulp by removing or chemically modifying the residual lignin and other chromophoric or color-producing substances that remain in the pulp after cooking and washing. The bleaching of chemical pulp is typically accomplished through a sequence of chemical treatment stages, with the specific chemicals and conditions used varying depending on the type of pulp, the desired brightness level, and environmental considerations. Traditional bleaching sequences relied heavily on elemental chlorine and chlorine dioxide as bleaching agents, but environmental concerns about the formation of chlorinated organic compounds, including dioxins and furans, in bleaching effluents have led to significant changes in bleaching practices over the past several decades. The most widely used bleaching approach in modern craft pulp mills is elemental chlorine-free, or ECF, bleaching, which employs chlorine dioxide as the primary bleaching agent rather than elemental chlorine. A typical ECF bleaching sequence might consist of 4 to 6 stages, designated by letter codes such as D, E, O, and P, where D represents a chlorine dioxide stage. E represents an alkaline extraction stage in which the pulp is treated with sodium hydroxide to dissolve the lignin that has been oxidized in the preceding bleaching stage. O represents an oxygen delignification stage, and P represents a hydrogen peroxide stage. The oxygen delignification stage, which is typically performed before the bleaching sequence proper, has become widely adopted in modern craft pulp mills as a means of reducing the amount of lignin that must be removed in the subsequent bleaching stages, thereby reducing the consumption of bleaching chemicals and the quantity of pollutants discharged in the bleaching effluent. An alternative approach to bleaching that has gained increasing attention in response to environmental concerns is totally chlorine-free, or TCF, bleaching, which avoids the use of any chlorine-containing compounds and relies instead on bleaching agents such as oxygen, hydrogen peroxide, ozone, and peracetic acid. TCF bleaching is practiced in a relatively small number of pulp mills worldwide, primarily in Scandinavia, and while it produces pulp that is free of any chlorinated organic residues, the brightness levels achievable with TCF bleaching are generally somewhat lower than those achievable with ECF bleaching, and the process tends to be somewhat more expensive and more difficult to control. The brightness of bleached pulp is measured using standardized methods and is expressed as a percentage on the ISO brightness scale, which ranges from 0, representing a perfectly absorbing surface, to 100, representing a perfectly reflecting surface. Typical ISO brightness values for fully bleached craft pulp are in the range of 88 to 92%, while semi-bleached or unbleached craft pulp may have brightness values in the range of 25 to 60%, depending on the degree of processing. The brightness of mechanical pulps is typically in the range of 55 to 65% for unbleached pulp and can be increased to approximately 70 to 80% through bleaching with hydrogen peroxide or sodium hydrosulfite. Although the brightness gain is typically less stable than that achieved with chemical pulps due to the continued presence of lignin in the mechanical pulp. Before the pulp can be used for papermaking, it typically undergoes a process known as refining or beating, in which the pulp fibers are subjected to mechanical treatment between rotating metal plates and devices known as disc refiners or conical refiners. The purpose of refining is to modify the physical properties of the fibers in ways that improve their bonding ability and other papermaking characteristics. During refining, the fibers are subjected to a combination of compressive and shearing forces that cause the outer layers of the fiber cell wall to be partially removed or fibrillated, creating a frayed, hairy surface on the fibers that increases their surface area and promotes the formation of hydrogen bonds between adjacent fibers during the subsequent papermaking and drying process. Refining also causes the fibers to become more flexible and conformable, which allows them to collapse more readily and to conform more closely to the surfaces of neighboring fibers in the paper sheet, further promoting interfiber bonding. The degree of refining is carefully controlled, as excessive refining can damage the fibers, reduce their length, and produce a pulp that drains slowly on the paper machine and that yields a paper with undesirable properties, such as excessive density and transparency. The degree of refining is typically measured using a freeness test, such as the Canadian Standard Freeness Test, which measures the rate at which water drains from a standard quantity of pulp under specified conditions, with lower freeness values indicating more heavily refined pulp. The entire sequence of pulping, washing, screening, and bleaching is a continuous process in a modern pulp mill, with the wood chips entering at one end and the finished bleached pulp emerging at the other end as a dilute suspension of fibers in water, typically at a consistency of approximately 1 to 4% by weight. This pulp suspension may then be used directly in an integrated paper mill, where the pulp and paper manufacturing operations are located at the same site, or it may be dried and formed into sheets or bales for shipment to a separate paper mill, a form known as market pulp. The drying of market pulp is itself a significant industrial operation, typically involving the use of large air-drying machines or flash dryers that reduce the moisture content of the pulp from approximately 50% to approximately 10%, producing a product that is suitable for storage and transportation over extended periods without significant deterioration. The transformation of pulp into finished paper is accomplished on large, complex machines that operate continuously and at high speeds, and the most common type of paper machine in use today is the Fourdrinier machine, a device that takes its name from the brothers Henry and Celie Fourdrinier, two London-based stationers who financed the development and construction of the first practical continuous paper-making machine in England in the early 19th century. The original concept for a machine capable of producing paper in a continuous web, rather than as individual sheets formed one at a time by hand, is generally attributed to Louis Nicolas Robert, a Frenchman who was employed at the dyed paper mill at Essonnes, near Paris, and who in 1799 obtained a patent for a device that formed a continuous sheet of paper on a moving wire screen. Robert's invention, while innovative in concept, was not entirely practical in its original form, and it was the subsequent refinement and development of the machine by Brian Donkin, a skilled English engineer who was commissioned by the Fourdrinier brothers, that resulted in a commercially viable machine that was first successfully operated at Frogmore Mill in Hertfordshire, England, in 1803, and that was patented by Donkin in 1804. The Fourdrinier machine, as it has evolved over the more than 2 centuries since its initial development, is an extraordinarily long and complex piece of equipment, with a modern high-speed machine typically measuring between 100 and 200 meters in length, or in some cases even longer, and being capable of producing paper at speeds of up to 2,000 meters per minute, or approximately 120 kilometers per hour, although speeds of 800 to 1,500 meters per minute are more typical for many grades of paper. The width of the paper produced on a Fourdrinier machine, known as the trim width, is typically in the range of 5 to 10 meters, although machines with trim widths of up to 11 meters are in operation at some mills. The capital cost of a new, state-of-the-art Fourdrinier machine, including all associated equipment and installation, can be in the range of several $100 million to over $1 billion, making it one of the most expensive single pieces of industrial equipment in the world. The operation of a Fourdrinier paper machine can be broadly divided into several major sections, each of which performs a specific function in the process of converting the dilute pulp suspension into a finished sheet of paper. These sections are, in the order in which the paper passes through them, the headbox, the forming section, the press section, the drying section, and, where applicable, the calendaring and coating sections. Each of these sections will now be described in what may be regarded as an appropriate level of detail for the purposes of this narrative. The headbox is the component of the paper machine that receives the dilute pulp suspension, known as the furnish, from the stock preparation system and distributes it evenly across the full width of the forming section. The furnish entering the headbox typically has a consistency of approximately 0.5 to 1.5% by weight, which means that between 99.5 and 98.5% of the material flowing through the headbox is water, with the remainder being pulp fibers and any additives that have been incorporated into the furnish during stock preparation. The headbox must deliver this very dilute suspension in a uniform, controlled jet across a width that may exceed 10 meters, and the design and operation of the headbox have a critical influence on the quality and uniformity of the finished paper. Modern headboxes are typically of the hydraulic type, in which the furnish is distributed across the machine width through a tapered header and a series of tube banks or flow channels, and the velocity and pressure of the furnish jet are controlled by adjusting the opening of a slice, which is a narrow, adjustable gap at the discharge end of the headbox through which the furnish emerges as a thin, flat jet. The forming section, also known as the wet end of the paper machine, is where the sheet of paper is initially formed from the dilute pulp suspension. In a conventional Fourdrinier machine, the forming section consists of a continuous loop of finely woven synthetic mesh, known as the forming fabric or wire, which is supported and driven by a series of rollers, and which moves in a horizontal or slightly inclined plane at a speed that is matched to the speed of the furnished jet emerging from the headbox. The furnished jet is deposited onto the upper surface of the moving forming fabric, and as the fabric carries the deposited furnish forward, water drains through the fabric under the influence of gravity and various drainage-promoting devices, while the pulp fibers are retained on the upper surface of the fabric, gradually forming a wet, coherent sheet of matted fibers known as the wet web. The drainage of water from the furnish through the forming fabric is a critical aspect of the sheet forming process, and is promoted by a variety of devices that are positioned beneath the forming fabric. In the initial portion of the forming section, drainage occurs primarily under the influence of gravity and the momentum of the water in the downward direction. But as the web moves further along the forming fabric and the mat of fibers on the surface becomes thicker and less permeable, additional drainage assistance is required. This assistance is provided by a series of devices including table rolls, which are small diameter rolls positioned beneath the fabric that create a slight vacuum on their downstream side as the fabric passes over them, and foils, also known as hydrofoils, which are stationary blades positioned beneath the fabric at a slight angle that create a pulsating vacuum as the fabric moves over them, promoting drainage while also agitating the fiber mat to improve its formation, which is a term used in the paper industry to describe the uniformity of the distribution of fibers in the sheet. Further along the forming section, more aggressive drainage devices are employed, including suction boxes, which are rectangular boxes positioned beneath the fabric and connected to a vacuum system that applies a controlled vacuum of typically 15 to 50 kilopascals to the underside of the web, drawing water through the fabric at a significantly higher rate than is achieved by the gravity-based drainage devices. At the very end of the forming section, a suction couch roll, which is a large diameter roll with a perforated shell connected to a vacuum system, provides the final stage of water removal on the forming fabric and assists in the transfer of the wet web from the forming fabric to the press section. By the end of the forming section, the consistency of the wet web has typically been increased from the initial 0.5 to 1.5% to approximately 18 to 25%, which means that between 75 and 82% of the web still consists of water, and further water removal is necessary before the web can be considered to be paper. The press section of the paper machine consists of a series of nip presses, typically 2 to 4 in number, through which the wet web is passed in order to mechanically squeeze out additional water and to consolidate the fiber mat. Each nip press consists of 2 large diameter rolls that are pressed together under a load that may be in the range of 50 to 300 kilonewtons per meter of machine width, creating a narrow zone of high pressure, known as the nip, through which the web passes. The web is carried into the nip on a continuous loop of absorbent material known as a press felt, which serves both to support the wet web and to receive the water that is squeezed from the web in the nip. In many modern press configurations, the web is pressed between two felts, one on each side, in what is known as a double-felted nip, which promotes more uniform water removal from both sides of the sheet. The water that is squeezed from the web in the press nip is absorbed by the press felt and is subsequently removed from the felt by suction devices and conditioning equipment, so that the felt is returned to a sufficiently dry state to absorb water again in the next cycle. The efficiency of the pressing process depends on a number of factors, including the applied load, the speed of the machine, the design of the press rolls and felts, and the properties of the web being pressed. In a modern press section, the consistency of the web is typically increased from approximately 18 to 25% at the end of the forming section to approximately 38 to 55% at the exit of the press section, representing a significant removal of water that would otherwise have to be removed by the much more energy-intensive process of evaporation in the drying section. It has been estimated that the removal of water by pressing is approximately 10 to 20 times more energy efficient than the removal of water by evaporation, which underscores the importance of maximizing the efficiency of the press section in order to reduce the overall energy consumption of the paper machine. The drying section of the paper machine is typically the longest section of the machine, often accounting for more than half of the total machine length, and it is where the remaining water in the web is removed by evaporation. The most common type of dryer used in paper machines is the multi-cylinder dryer, which consists of a series of large, hollow, cast iron or steel cylinders, typically 1.5 to 1.8 meters in diameter, that are heated internally by steam at temperatures in the range of 100 to 180 degrees Celsius, depending on the position of the cylinder in the drying section and the grade of paper being produced. The web is passed alternately over the upper and lower surfaces of successive dryer cylinders, being held in contact with the cylinder surfaces by continuous loops of permeable fabric known as dryer felts or dryer fabrics, which serve to press the web against the hot cylinder surfaces and to support the web as it passes between cylinders. As the web passes over each successive dryer cylinder, heat is transferred from the steam inside the cylinder, through the cylinder wall, and into the web, causing the water in the web to evaporate. The evaporated water is carried away by the ventilation system of the drying section, which supplies heated air to the spaces between the dryer cylinders and exhausts the moisture-laden air to the atmosphere or to a heat recovery system. The temperature of the web increases progressively as it passes through the drying section, and the rate of water removal varies along the length of the section, being highest in the initial stages, where the web is still relatively wet and the rate of evaporation is limited primarily by the rate of heat transfer and decreasing in the later stages, where the web is drier and the rate of evaporation is increasingly limited by the rate of diffusion of water from the interior of the web to its surface. A modern paper machine drying section may contain between 40 and 80 dryer cylinders, arranged in groups of typically 4 to 8 cylinders, with each group having its own dryer fabric and drive system. The total amount of water that must be evaporated in the drying section is substantial, as the web enters the section at a consistency of approximately 38 to 55% and must be dried to a final moisture content of typically 4 to 8%, depending on the grade of paper being produced. For a machine producing 1,000 metric tons of paper per day, this may correspond to the evaporation of approximately 1,200 to 2,000 metric tons of water per day, which requires a correspondingly large amount of thermal energy, typically supplied in the form of steam generated in the mill's power plant or recovery boiler. The energy consumption of the drying section typically accounts for approximately 60 to 70% of the total energy consumption of the paper machine, which is a reflection of the thermodynamic reality that the evaporation of water requires a large amount of energy, approximately 2,260 kilojoules per kilogram of water evaporated at atmospheric pressure. Following the drying section, the paper may pass through a calendaring section, where it is subjected to additional pressing between smooth, hard rolls in order to improve the surface smoothness and reduce the thickness variation, or caliper variation, of the finished sheet. Calendaring may be performed on machine, using calendar stacks that are located at the end of the paper machine or off machine, using separate supercalendar or soft calendar machines. On-machine calendaring typically involves the passage of the paper through one or more nips formed between hard, cast iron, or steel rolls, with the applied load and the temperature of the rolls being adjusted to achieve the desired surface properties. Supercalendaring, which is an off-machine process used to produce papers with a very high degree of surface smoothness and gloss, involves the passage of the paper through a stack of alternating hard steel rolls and soft rolls made of materials such as compressed cotton or synthetic polymer, with the paper making multiple passes through the nips at temperatures of approximately 60 to 120 degrees Celsius. For certain grades of paper, particularly those intended for high-quality printing applications, the surface of the paper may be treated with a coating, which is a layer of pigment and binder that is applied to one or both sides of the paper in order to improve its surface smoothness, brightness, gloss, and ink receptivity. The most commonly used coating pigments are kaolin clay, also known as china clay, and calcium carbonate, which may be in the form of ground calcium carbonate obtained by grinding natural limestone or marble, or precipitated calcium carbonate, which is produced by a chemical process involving the reaction of calcium hydroxide with carbon dioxide. The coating is typically applied as an aqueous suspension or coating color, consisting of approximately 60 to 70% solids by weight, with the pigment particles constituting the major component and the binder, which is typically a synthetic latex such as styrene butadiene latex or an acrylic latex, constituting approximately 8 to 15 parts per 100 parts of pigment. The coating is applied to the paper using various types of coating equipment, including blade coaters, in which the coating color is applied to the paper surface and then metered to the desired thickness by a flexible steel blade that is held in contact with the paper surface under controlled pressure, air knife coaters, in which the coating is metered by a jet of air, and rod coaters, in which the coating is metered by a rotating rod. The coated paper is then dried, typically using infrared heaters and hot air dryers, and may subsequently be calendared to achieve the desired surface finish. The properties of the finished paper are characterized by a number of measurable parameters, each of which is relevant to the suitability of the paper for its intended application. Among the most important of these properties are basis weight, caliper, brightness, opacity, and tensile strength. Basis weight, also known as grammage, is the mass of the paper per unit area and is typically expressed in grams per square meter. Common basis weights for printing and writing papers are in the range of 60 to 120 grams per square meter, while tissue papers may have basis weights as low as 12 to 25 grams per square meter. And heavy paperboard products may have basis weights of 200 to 600 grams per square meter or more. Caliper is the thickness of the paper, typically measured in micrometers or thousandths of a millimeter, using a precision micrometer under a standardized applied pressure. The caliper of paper is related to its basis weight and density, with lower density papers having a higher caliper for a given basis weight than higher density papers. Brightness, as mentioned earlier, is a measure of the reflectance of the paper surface at a wavelength of 457 nanometers and is expressed as a percentage on the ISO brightness scale. Opacity is a measure of the extent to which the paper prevents the transmission of light, or, in practical terms, the extent to which printing on one side of the paper is visible from the other side, and is expressed as a percentage, with higher values indicating greater opacity. Tensile strength is the maximum force per unit width that the paper can withstand before breaking when subjected to a pulling force, and is typically expressed in kilonewtons per meter. The tensile strength of paper is generally higher in the machine direction, which is the direction of travel of the paper through the machine, than in the cross-machine direction. Due to the preferential alignment of fibers in the machine direction that occurs during the forming process. These properties, and many others, are routinely measured and controlled during the paper-making process using a combination of laboratory testing of samples taken from the machine and online measurement systems that continuously monitor the properties of the paper as it is being produced. Modern paper machines are equipped with sophisticated quality control systems that use sensors mounted on scanning frames that traverse the width of the paper web to measure properties such as basis weight, moisture content, caliper, and ash content at frequent intervals, and that feed this information back to the machine control system to enable automatic adjustment of process parameters in order to maintain the paper properties within specified tolerances. The level of automation and process control that has been achieved in modern papermaking is truly remarkable, with many aspects of machine operation being controlled by computer systems that continuously optimize dozens or hundreds of process variables in real time, based on the data provided by the online measurement systems and on mathematical models of the papermaking process that have been developed over many years of research and operational experience, the world of paper encompasses a remarkably diverse range of products, extending far beyond the familiar sheets of printing and writing paper that are encountered in offices and homes, and including numerous specialty papers that have been developed to meet specific and often quite demanding requirements. Among these specialty products, tissue paper occupies a position of particular commercial importance, representing a category of lightweight, soft, absorbent papers that are produced in enormous quantities for use as facial tissue, toilet tissue, paper towels, napkins, and various other hygiene and cleaning products. The production of tissue paper involves some significant differences from the production of printing and writing papers, reflecting the very different properties that are required of the finished product, particularly the need for softness, bulk, and absorbency rather than the smoothness, strength, and printability that are prioritized in printing papers. Tissue paper is typically produced on specialized paper machines known as tissue machines, which differ from conventional fourdrinier machines in several important respects. The most distinctive feature of a tissue machine is the Yankee dryer, which is a single, very large steam-heated cylinder, typically 3 to 6 meters in diameter, on which the wet tissue web is dried. The wet web is pressed onto the surface of the Yankee dryer by a press roll, and as the web is carried around the surface of the rotating cylinder, it is dried by the combined effects of the steam heat conducted through the cylinder wall and hot air blown onto the outer surface of the web by a series of high-velocity air jets from a device known as a Yankee hood. The dried tissue is then removed from the surface of the Yankee dryer by a steel blade known as a craping doctor, which scrapes the tissue from the cylinder surface and, in the process, imparts a characteristic wrinkled or creped texture to the tissue that is responsible for much of its softness and bulk. The degree of creping, which is controlled by the relationship between the speed of the Yankee dryer and the speed at which the tissue is wound onto the reel, has a significant effect on the properties of the finished tissue, with higher degrees of creping producing softer, bulkier tissue with lower tensile strength. The basis weight of tissue paper is typically in the range of 12 to 25 grams per square meter for single-ply products, which is considerably lighter than the 60 to 120 grams per square meter that is typical of printing and writing papers. The low basis weight, combined with the creped structure, gives tissue paper its characteristic softness and flexibility. The global production of tissue paper has been growing steadily for many decades, driven by rising living standards and increasing hygiene awareness, and was estimated at approximately 42 million metric tons per year in the early 2020s. Representing approximately 10% of total global paper and paperboard production. Paperboard, which is sometimes informally referred to as cardboard, is another major category of paper products that differs significantly from printing and writing papers in its properties and applications. Paperboard is a thick, rigid form of paper that is produced in a range of grades and thicknesses for use in packaging applications, including the manufacture of boxes, cartons, and other containers. The basis weight of paperboard is typically in the range of 200 to 600 grams per square meter, and the caliper is typically in the range of 300 to 800 micrometers, which is considerably thicker than the 80 to 120 micrometers that is typical of printing and writing papers. Paperboard is frequently produced as a multi-layer product with different layers, or plies, being formed separately and then combined on the paper machine to produce a sheet with the desired combination of surface properties, strength, and stiffness. Watermarked paper is a specialty product that has been produced for many centuries and that continues to be manufactured for applications where a distinctive mark of origin or quality is desired. A watermark is a pattern or design that is incorporated into the paper during the manufacturing process by variations in the thickness of the sheet, which are created by a raised design on the forming wire or, in modern machines, on a special roll known as a dandy roll that presses against the wet web during the forming process. When the finished paper is held up to the light, the watermark is visible as a pattern of lighter and darker areas, corresponding to the thinner and thicker portions of the sheet, respectively. Watermarks have been used as a means of identifying the manufacturer and quality of paper since the 13th century, when they were first introduced by the papermakers of Fabriano, Italy, and they continue to be used for this purpose today, as well as serving as a security feature in various types of documents. Security paper, which is used for the production of banknotes, passports, identity documents, and other items where resistance to counterfeiting is of paramount importance, represents one of the most technically sophisticated categories of specialty paper. The production of security paper involves the incorporation of a wide range of features that are designed to make the paper difficult to reproduce using conventional printing or copying equipment, including specialized watermarks, embedded security threads made of metal or polymer, fluorescent fibers, or planchettes that are visible under ultraviolet light, and chemical sensitizers that cause the paper to change color or produce visible marks when subjected to certain chemicals that might be used in counterfeiting attempts. The paper used for banknotes in many countries is produced not from wood pulp but from cotton fiber, which produces a paper with a distinctive feel and durability that is difficult to replicate using wood-based papers. The cotton fiber used for banknote paper is typically obtained from cotton linters, which are the short fibers that remain on the cottonseed after the longer staple fibers have been removed for use in the textile industry. The recycling of paper is a process that has been practiced in various forms for centuries, but that has become a subject of particularly widespread attention and activity since the latter decades of the 20th century. Driven by growing awareness of environmental issues and by economic considerations related to the cost and availability of virgin fiber. Paper recycling involves the collection of used paper products, their conversion back into pulp, and the use of this recycled pulp in the manufacture of new paper products. The basic steps of the paper recycling process include repulping, dinking, contaminant removal, and, where necessary, bleaching, each of which involves specific technical challenges that must be addressed in order to produce recycled pulp of acceptable quality. Repulping, which is the first step in the recycling process, involves the disintegration of the collected waste paper in a large vessel known as a pulpier or repulper, which typically consists of a cylindrical tank equipped with a rotating impeller or rotor that agitates the waste paper in the presence of water and, in some cases, chemical additives such as sodium hydroxide or sodium silicate, which assist in the separation of fibers and the detachment of inks and other contaminants from the fiber surfaces. The repulping process typically takes between 15 and 45 minutes and produces a slurry of fibers and contaminants that is then subjected to further processing to remove the unwanted materials. Deinking, which is one of the most critical steps in the recycling of waste paper intended for the production of white or light-colored papers, is the process of removing printing inks and other colored contaminants from the recycled pulp. The two principal methods of deinking are flotation deinking and wash deinking, which may be used individually or in combination, depending on the type of waste paper being processed and the quality requirements of the finished product. In flotation deinking, the pulp is diluted to a consistency of approximately 0.8 to 1.5% and treated with surfactants and other chemicals that promote the detachment of ink particles from the fiber surfaces and their attachment to air bubbles that are introduced into the pulp suspension. The ink-laden air bubbles rise to the surface of the flotation cell, where they form a froth that is skimmed off and removed, carrying the ink particles with it. In wash deinking, the detached ink particles, which must be sufficiently small to pass through the openings in a wire screen, are removed from the pulp by dilution and washing on a series of screen or filter elements. Contaminant removal is another important aspect of the paper recycling process and involves the removal of non-fiber materials such as plastic films, adhesive residues known as stickies, staples, paper clips, and other items that may be present in the collected waste paper. These contaminants are removed through a combination of screening, which uses perforated plates or slotted screens to separate the contaminants from the fibers based on size differences, and cleaning, which uses centrifugal separators known as hydrocyclones or cleaners to separate the contaminants from the fibers based on differences in density. The effective removal of contaminants is essential for the production of high-quality recycled paper and is one of the more technically challenging aspects of the recycling process, particularly in the case of adhesive contaminants, which can cause significant problems in the paper-making process by depositing on machine components and causing defects in the finished paper. The environmental considerations associated with paper production and consumption are numerous and multifaceted, encompassing issues related to the use of natural resources, the generation of pollutants, and the management of waste. The paper industry is a significant consumer of several important natural resources, including wood, water, and energy. And the management and conservation of these resources are matters of considerable importance from both environmental and economic perspectives. The consumption of wood by the paper industry is closely linked to the broader issue of forest management and conservation, and the paper industry has been both criticized for its contribution to deforestation and praised for its efforts to promote sustainable forestry practices. The concept of sustainable forestry, which involves the management of forest resources in a manner that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, has been formalized through the development of forest certification systems, the two most widely recognized of which are the Forest Stewardship Council, commonly known as FSC, which was established in 1993, and the Program for the Endorsement of Forest Certification, commonly known as PFC, which was established in 1999. These certification systems establish standards for the management of forest resources, including requirements related to the maintenance of biodiversity, the protection of water resources, the rights of indigenous peoples, and the long-term productivity of the forest, and they provide a mechanism by which paper products can be labeled to indicate that the fiber from which they are made has been sourced from responsibly managed forests. The water consumption of the paper industry is another significant environmental consideration, as the production of paper requires large quantities of water for the various stages of the process, including pulping, washing, bleaching, and the paper machine itself. The water consumption of a modern paper mill is typically in the range of 10 to 50 cubic meters per metric ton of paper produced, depending on the type of paper, the degree of water recycling practiced at the mill, and various other factors. While this represents a significant reduction from the water consumption levels of several decades ago, which could be 100 cubic meters per ton or more, the paper industry remains a substantial consumer of water, and further reductions in water consumption are a continuing objective of the industry's environmental management efforts. The wastewater discharged by paper mills, known as effluent, must be treated to remove suspended solids, dissolved organic matter, and other pollutants before it can be released to the environment. And modern paper mills typically operate sophisticated wastewater treatment systems that include primary clarification, biological treatment, and, in some cases, tertiary treatment processes. The energy consumption of the paper industry is also a matter of environmental significance, as the industry is one of the largest industrial consumers of energy in many countries. The energy required for paper production includes both thermal energy, which is used primarily for the drying of paper and the evaporation of water in the chemical recovery process, and electrical energy, which is used to drive the motors, pumps, refiners, and other equipment in the mill. The total energy consumption of a modern integrated pulp and paper mill, producing bleached kraft pulp and printing paper, is typically in the range of 20 to 40 gigajoules per metric ton of paper produced. However, the kraft pulping process generates a significant amount of energy from the combustion of the dissolved organic matter in the black liquor, and many modern kraft pulp mills are net producers of energy, generating more thermal and electrical energy from the combustion of black liquor and wood residues than they consume in the production process. The global production of paper and paperboard was estimated at approximately 400 to 420 million metric tons per year in the early 2020s, with the largest producing countries being China, which accounted for approximately 25 to 28% of global production, the United States, which accounted for approximately 17 to 18%, and Japan, which accounted for approximately 5 to 6%. Global paper consumption has been characterized by significant regional variations, with per capita consumption being highest in the developed countries of North America, Europe, and East Asia, where it typically ranges from approximately 100 to 250 kilograms per person per year, and lowest in the developing countries of Africa and South Asia, where per capita consumption may be as low as 5 to 15 kilograms per person per year. The patterns of paper consumption have been undergoing significant changes in recent years as a result of the widespread adoption of digital technologies for communication, information storage, and media consumption. The consumption of newsprint, which was one of the largest categories of paper production for much of the 20th century, has declined dramatically in many countries since the early 2000s, reflecting the shift of news readership from printed newspapers to online sources. Similarly, the consumption of office and printing papers has been affected by the increasing use of electronic communication and digital document management, although the extent of this effect has varied from country to country and has been somewhat less dramatic than the decline in newsprint consumption. On the other hand, the consumption of packaging papers and paperboard has been growing, driven by the expansion of e-commerce and the increasing use of paper-based packaging as a substitute for plastic packaging in response to consumer and regulatory concerns about plastic waste. The debate over the relative environmental merits of paper versus digital media is a complex one that does not lend itself to simple generalizations, as the environmental impact of each depends on a wide range of factors, including the source of the energy used to power digital devices and data centers, the extent to which paper products are recycled, the source of the fiber used to produce the paper, and the lifespan and disposal of electronic devices. Studies that have attempted to compare the environmental impacts of paper and digital media on a life cycle basis have generally concluded that the relative impacts depend on the specific circumstances of use, and that neither medium can be considered to be uniformly superior to the other from an environmental perspective. What can be stated with reasonable confidence is that both paper and digital media have significant environmental impacts, and that efforts to reduce these impacts should focus on improving the efficiency and sustainability of both production systems, rather than on simplistic arguments in favor of one medium over the other. The global paper recycling rate, which is the proportion of paper consumed that is subsequently collected and recycled, varies considerably from country to country, but has been generally increasing over recent decades. In many developed countries, the paper recycling rate has reached levels of approximately 60 to 75%, with some countries, such as Germany, South Korea, and Japan, achieving rates in excess of 70%. The quality of recycled fiber degrades somewhat with each successive cycle of recycling, as the fibers are shortened and damaged by the various mechanical and chemical processes involved in repulping and papermaking. and it is generally accepted that paper fibers can be recycled approximately 5 to 7 times before they become too short and weak to be useful for papermaking. For this reason, the paper recycling system requires a continuous input of virgin fiber to replace the fiber that is lost through quality degradation, contamination, and the inevitable losses that occur during the collection and processing of waste paper. The invention and spread of paper has had profound and far-reaching effects on human civilization, effects that are so deeply woven into the fabric of modern society that they are easy to overlook. The availability of an inexpensive, lightweight, and versatile writing material was a prerequisite for many of the developments that have shaped the modern world, including the spread of literacy and education, the development of printing and publishing, the creation of modern systems of administration and bureaucracy, and the advancement of science and scholarship. The Chinese invention of paper, followed by the development of woodblock printing in the 7th century and movable type printing in the 11th century, and the subsequent introduction of these technologies to Europe, where Johannes Gutenberg developed his famous printing press with movable metal type around 1440, set in motion a chain of developments that transformed the production and dissemination of information, and that ultimately contributed to such epoch-defining movements as the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution. The story of paper, as it has been recounted in this extended narrative, is one that spans more than 2 millennia and that encompasses a remarkable range of human ingenuity. From the early Chinese artisans who discovered that matted plant fibers could be formed into thin, flexible sheets suitable for writing, to the modern engineers and scientists who design and operate the enormous, high-speed paper machines of the 21st century. The production of paper remains, despite the many changes that have occurred in the ways that humans communicate and store information, a vital and economically significant industrial activity. And the material itself continues to play an important role in virtually every aspect of modern life, from the books and documents that preserve and transmit knowledge, to the packaging that protects and transports goods, to the humble tissue that is used and discarded without a second thought. The processes by which paper is produced, from the harvesting of trees in managed forests to the final winding of the finished paper onto enormous reels at the end of the paper machine, involve a degree of scientific and engineering sophistication that is rarely appreciated by the casual consumer of paper products. The chemistry of wood and its transformation into pulp, the physics of water removal from fiber mats, the mechanics of high-speed web transport, and the complexities of coding and calendaring all represent areas of technical endeavor that have been the subject of extensive research and development over many decades, and that continue to be refined and improved as the demands placed on paper products evolve and as new materials and technologies become available. It may be observed, in closing, that the very ordinariness of paper, its ubiquity and familiarity, tend to render it invisible in a sense, so that most people give little thought to the complex chain of processes and technologies that are required to produce the sheets of paper that they encounter every day. The purpose of this narrative has been to render visible some of that complexity, to describe in patient and thorough detail the many steps involved in the transformation of a living tree into a sheet of paper, and to convey some sense of the remarkable scientific and engineering achievements that underlie this seemingly simple material. Whether this purpose has been achieved, and whether the level of detail and the pace of the narrative have been sufficient to induce a state of relaxed drowsiness in the listener, are matters that the listener is invited to consider, or not, as the case may be. As this account of how paper is made draws quietly and uneventfully to its conclusion,